My name is Sean O'Rourke, originally from Ireland, but my parents emigrated to America at the turn of the century when I was just 12 years old. New York for a few years, then Chicago, where my father earned his living as a bricklayer. It was from him that I learned the value of an honest day's work. But when I was 20, I turned to a different trade to make my living, one that paid even more than his, that of a plasterer. I joined at a time when the Great War was ravaging in Europe, and 53,000 American lives were lost. When it finally ended, the war changed everything in our country too, especially the relationship between the government and big business. The government nationalised the railroads. It rationed food and fuel. It coerced unions to prevent strikes. And businesses quickly learned that they were now playing by a new set of rules, the government's. In 1918, the government created the Construction Division in the War Department to handle the largest single building program in history, with a program that would spend over a remarkable $1 billion. It was time for my trade to organise. That year, the Contracting Plasterers International Association, forerunner to the Association of the Wall and Ceiling Industry, was born. 26 lath and plastering contractors from 12 cities gathered at the Hamilton Hotel in Washington, D.C. to discuss how they would do business with the government. Their timing was fortuitous, as they were ideally positioned for what happened next, a construction boom. The Roaring Twenties were aptly named as construction saw a tremendous surge in growth, and the CPIA accomplished much during this period. Its members sat on important industry councils that directed the nation's construction industry. The association began standardized testing of materials and issued specifications for lathing and plastering. No detail was too small. For example, it would specify the grade of wood lath, the importance of having a 3/4 inch key between lath and the size of nails to use, and recommend which wood species to use for lath, depending on the region. CPIA also nurtured good relations with the unions for most of the decade. It chose to support organised labour and viewed union mechanics as both preserving the tradecraft and acting as industry's future employers. But towards the end of 20s, CPIA sided with the government over many important issues. This was providential. Soon, the Great Depression would overwhelm our lives. And as we all struggled to make ends meet, we found our government exerting control over the building industry in ways it never had before. Looking back, I believe President Roosevelt's government-controlled economy and work project programs of the 1930s were a mixed blessing. On the one hand, his New Deal put millions of us back to work. On the other hand, his government-run programs often gave the technical work of lathing and plastering to unskilled labourers. True, our industry survived, but not every company and journeyman did. In fact, the number of plastering and lathing employees in the construction industry decreased from 127,000 in 1929 to just 23,000 in 1933. In 1934, the construction industry set minimum wages and maximum work weeks, and eventually the cycle of supply and demand returned. All the while, the CPIA continued to fight to establish high standards for our work. But on the horizon were new building materials and applications. Substitutes, we call them. And so was another world war. As the 1940s began, the government called upon industry to mobilise for war. As with World War I, the US government tried to control resources by imposing price and wage controls. It was also a time when many construction sectors saw a decline in skilled labour. And this was true for walls and ceilings, where some markets had 6 plastering jobs for every plasterer. To address the labour shortage, contractors started using mechanical plastering tools. Stapling machines, for example, could attach metal lath corner reinforcement faster than conventional fastener applications. Gypsum board manufacturers boosted production during the 1940s too, gearing up for the construction boom that followed the war. Returning GIs needed homes, and gypsum board could deliver walls and ceilings faster than wet walls. When I first started in this business, in the early 1920s, plaster covered more than 90% of all residential interiors. By war's end, plaster's share dropped to about 60%. Indeed, in some parts of the country, plaster covered only 30% of the walls. My association took notice, and in the last year of the 1940s, CPIA's executive board declared it would find ways to halt the ever-increasing inroads being made by so-called drywall construction over lath and plaster. This was a battle I would miss, a showdown that would be fought by the next generation.
My name is Paul Truitt, originally from Texas, but now living on Long Island, New York. Except for my time in the Army, I've always been in the plastering business. In the 50s, the military taught me how to work with my hands, and an Army buddy suggested I look into the trade when I got out. "It pays well," he said. "What else do you need to know?" Looking back over my 30 years in the business, it turns out there was a lot to know. But my friend was right about the money. In the early 1950s, the construction business boomed as the Army boys returned home in search of a home. Congress funded public housing, guaranteed mortgage loans to veterans, and gave homeowners favorable tax treatment. Tract housing projects surged outside of the big cities too, like Levittown, New York, practically in my own backyard. New innovations in technology changed my craft as well. Fireproofing with lath, plaster, and lightweight aggregate grew substantially during the 1950s. It was also the first time a plaster spray gun was used. This new invention could spray on a thick coat of plaster an inch or more, and soon enough there were multiple spray guns with names like Plaster Master, Sandhog, Gun All, and Tommy Gun. Our association, the CPIA, enacted agreements with the unions that included how these plaster pumps and spray guns could be used on job sites. Still, their invention was a double-edged sword. This was a tough time for union plasterers since the mechanization took away much of the skill and hours needed to plaster by hand. But over time, as we got comfortable using these new tools, we realized they made our work easier, and we became more competitive. And competitive we needed to be as our business was being encroached by the growing popularity of drywall as an alternative to plaster and lath. It was my association's top issue for years. We were, after all, the Contracting Plasterers International Association, later renaming ourselves the Contracting Plasterers and Lathers International Association in 1957. The association had battled substitutes to lath and plaster from the beginning, but by the middle of the decade, and despite intense promotion, it was losing the battle. Drywall surpassed 50% market share of residential construction, and drywall's growth would only accelerate. The development of self-drilling screws and cold-form steel framing during the 1960s would make sure of that. As the 60s roared in on another wave of rising construction, commercial drywall took off. Builders were starting to switch the interiors of buildings from plaster to gypsum board. And the Gypsum Drywall Contractors International, a rival of our CPLIA, grew by leaps and bounds as more and more local drywall associations joined this new national organization. Drywall grew in large part because producers pushed a systems approach to sell their products. Wallboard and metal stud framing, fastened special clips, and later self-drilling screws was a golden combination. The first cavity shaft wall system was introduced in 1968 and later used in the construction of the World Trade Center. Shaft walls could be built with no need for scaffolding inside stair towers and elevator shafts. And they saved money by replacing masonry and plaster, materials more expensive and laborious to use than fire-rated gypsum board and cold-form steel framing. On the outside, it looked like CPLIA was doing everything it could to preserve the status quo. The Bureau's knock-on-the-wall advertising campaigns ran full force, conveying plaster is supreme, drywall is shoddy. But on the inside, more and more CPLIA members were actively bidding drywall and acoustical tile, and leaving the organization altogether. The membership count dropped from 490 to 405 during the decade, as the CPLIA once again considered a new name. The Association of Finishing Contractors was one suggestion. The Architectural Environment Contractors Association was another. Finally, as the decade ended, the CPLIA, which had always promoted lathing and plastering services, changed its name to the all-encompassing International Association of the Wall and Ceiling Contractors. But it wouldn't be until the next decade before two associations courting the same unions, manufacturers, distributors, and contractors, would combine into one. The 1970s was not the easiest time to raise a family, buy a house, or start a business, as the economy rode a pendulum between boom, bust, and boom again, lending pressure for the two associations to merge once and for all. Some contractors wanted nothing to do with it. They felt being specialized, not generalized, had value. As they saw it, combining two associations would create one big, bureaucratic beast. But deep down, most drywall and plastering contractors felt a kinship, a sense of alignment in their craft. Finally, the lathing, plastering, and drywall contractors were formally united as a new association. The AWCI/GDCI would become official on July 2, 1976. 3 years later, it was renamed the Association of the Wall and Ceiling Industries International. The 1970s ushered in another new technology, this time in the form of load-bearing metal framing. Engineers used cold-formed steel to develop the low-rise and mid-rise building markets. Steel studs and joists could form a complete structural framework and bear the building's entire load. Cold-formed steel was versatile too, and it could be used to build ceilings, floors, partitions, flat and pitched roof trusses, and fire-rated walls. Combined, these new technologies gave rise to the modern distributor. Drywall had become a project staple, so had metal studs, self-drilling screws, plasters with lightweight aggregate additives, mechanical pumps, spray guns, fireproofing, suspended ceiling grid, and acoustical ceiling tile. The progressive distributor had to diversify and carry these product categories. A flatbed truck hauling bagged goods could no longer keep up. The industry's distributors had to become building materials suppliers. As I look back on my profession, I started when firms were just plastering contractors or drywall contractors. Now, as I near retirement, they've become interior and exterior systems contractors, taking jobs from the slab on up and led by a new association that would take them to heights I could scarcely imagine.
My name is Walter Jacobs, son of David Jacobs. That's important to know because I'm the owner of Jacobs & Sons Construction, located in sunny Sacramento, California. My dad opened the business over 40 years ago, and because I grew up with it, I was comfortable being the second-generation owner. I took over at the right time, too, as the 1980s were one of the best decades financially for the construction industry. It's a funny thing, too, because when my dad retired at the end of the 70s, overbuilding had produced a glut of office space, and residential construction had ballooned to 26%, which was much more than the nation needed. So you'd think construction would have slowed down, but it didn't. You see, the energy crisis of the 1970s had driven Americans to seek energy efficiency for their homes and commercial buildings. Homeowners started remodeling projects. Building owners sought large-scale retrofits. So when I took over in the early 80s, wall and ceiling construction was actually bright and bountiful. My dad talked about innovations being key to the growth of our business, but he didn't see anything like I did. Panelization is one example. The prefabrication of walls and other assemblies represented a huge growth opportunity, and my association, AWCI, was on top of the trend early, offering seminars on how to take advantage of the technology. Manufacturers introduced new products that helped my business too, like lightweight joint compound that was easier to handle than conventional weight products, with less shrinkage and easier to sand. Even the architects helped our growth when they started specifying sound attenuation systems on projects. We we quickly discovered acoustical wall systems were very profitable, thank you very much. Another growth area was asbestos abatement, and throughout the decade, AWCI provided us with the legal and technical direction to take advantage of this new market segment. And with the unabated growth of its membership, the association was able to offer another innovative feature, lifetime membership. Our prosperity allowed us to avoid annual dues and simply make a one-time payment to be members for life. The 1980s was truly a remarkable time for my company. The government's economic policies worked in our favor. We saw the end of the Cold War with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the rise of the digital age, and the association shared in the boom times, doubling their membership participation at AWCI's convention from 1,500 attendees in 1980 to over 3,000 in 1989. I learned early on from my father that our business could be subject to rapid booms and busts. What I learned on my own, however, was that these same conditions could apply to my association. AWCI entered the 1990s running a budget deficit. There were dues delinquencies and the loss of chapters, but of the $125,000 deficit, $81,000 was attributed to the Asbestos Abatement Council, an entity that had run its course. The AWCI leadership made some bold moves that decade. They shut down the Abatement Council. They sold their headquarters building in Alexandria, Virginia. They increased the number of lifetime members, and they bolstered their educational materials, publishing handbooks and safety manuals in Spanish. They produced a series of new EIFS education videos and rewrote the 150-page EIFS workbook to improve the quality of work being done. Now, industry mechanics could get EIFS education while they studied at home. As a result, AWCI went from $125,000 in the red to $1 million in the black before the decade ended. It was just in time, too, as new and unexpected challenges broke at the turn of the century. I still remember when Time magazine called the 2000s the decade from hell. During that time, we witnessed 9/11, the losses in Iraq and Afghanistan, Hurricane Katrina, and the Great Recession. It was a time when the S&P 500 lost 38% of its value, while the number of jobs lost was close to 2 million. World events affected our business. I would have welcomed a steady supply of Hispanic drywallers and tapers, for example, but the legislation enacted after 9/11 put an end to that. And when the recession hit later, I had to lay off some of my employees, something I hated to do. Nationally, construction unemployment ballooned to over 19%. Not everything about the 2000s was bad, however. New innovations were introduced, such as EQ, or equivalent, metal studs, which was a lighter weight alternative to the standard metal studs, and EQ coatings to protect those studs. And despite the tough economic times, my association continued to thrive. At the beginning of the 2000s, the renewal rate for contractors was at 84%, an all-time high. Membership was up, too, to over 1,200. During the 2000s, AWCI broadened its EIFS course curriculum to reach more mechanics, inspectors, and professionals. It expanded its popular curriculum of Doing It Right programs, while the Foundation of the Wall and Ceiling Industry published leading industry research papers annually. Still, for individual businesses like mine, it was rough going. I'd seen the boom of the 80s and the 90s and the bust of the 2000s. It was time for me to retire and turn the reins over to the next generation.
My name is Pat Clark. Lived in Fort Worth, Texas all my life, and I was part of the boomlet of new construction workers that joined the industry in the early 2010s. What a difference a few years makes. At the beginning of 2010, the Great Recession had the economy in a hammer vise. But a year later, the multifamily housing market broke that grip with a 22% growth rate. 2 years after that, another 189,000 construction jobs had been added with large multi-billion projects in multiple cities. Now, the industry had to reckon with having too many projects and not enough workers. To ease the shortage, wall and ceiling contractors turned to panelization for quality and speed, and new technologies such as PDF annotation apps and ultra-lightweight products. It's been a time of great migration in our industry. The Great Recession left wall and ceiling contractors somewhat decimated at their managerial levels. Some senior project managers and superintendents retired when construction activity dried up, or they were downsized and lost their jobs. Now, with a building boom underway, a new generation was entering the industry's management ranks, but at a younger age than previously, so they lacked the collaborative leadership skills they would need to do management work. AWCI recognized what was happening and early on started drafting a course in management and leadership development, calling it the Project Manager Development Series. It's something I'm looking forward to taking. The association also focused on the need to find more skilled labor and adopted a fresh immigration policy, which called for the support of guest workers and simple verification, and encouraged the government to build a pathway to legal employment for undocumented residents. The association has also rounded out its many educational programs, bringing them technically up to date. One thing I've learned about my association so far is that good leaders look to the past to help them find answers for the future. And when I think of those 26 members who formed the original association 100 years ago, I think they'd be rather surprised to learn that it's grown to 2,400 members today. And if they saw how their association really transformed the construction industry, from technical innovations to how well we take care of our people, I know they'd be very, very pleased.